Hey guys, today's topic is topic 5 on natural selection and classification. We're going to start off talking about our learning targets of explaining the process of natural selection, summarizing effects and mechanisms on different gene pools, and structural and physiological adaptations as a process of natural selection itself. What I wanted to look at here at first was just a quick look at a common misconception of what people think natural selection evolution is. And it says Beaver here, and he's got a chainsaw hand. He's saying, no, that's what I'm talking about. The idea is right here that's really important, right? Natural selection does not grant organisms what they need. It's not born necessarily out of a wish. This is a complex process that happens over time if a specific set of circumstances unfolds. So we have some key vocabulary and another comic or same Beaver friend here talking about what is also another common misconception. Adaptations do not involve trying, right? So an adaptation involving trying has nothing to do with it. It's not a wish. It's not something that can happen. He can't make that hand turn into a chainsaw to help him better survive and reproduce. Adaptations are inherited, and that's going to be the first thing that we talk about here. An adaptation is an inherited characteristic that increases an organism's chance of survival. Natural selection is a process which individuals that are better suited to their environment survive and reproduce. And finally, the term evolution is the most general term. It's a change in the genetic diversity of population over time. This is really, really big picture, general kind of term we use to say evolution of a species or a population happens through that process of natural selection. So to begin with, we're going to walk through a specific process of natural selection in kind of 5 or 6 steps here to show you what must happen in order for a species to change over time. And we're talking a very long period of time. So we have to have a population of organisms. They have to be able to breed and intermix, and within that population, this is the first requirement that must happen for natural selection to occur, is there must be an overproduction of offspring. There's more of these floating around than can survive. So more than can survive there. Here we have mutations and sexual reproduction producing variations among the offspring. Limited resources leads to a struggle for survival between our offspring. So there's not enough resources to go around. So some are going to live and some are going to die. And survivors are going to reproduce more successfully. And over a very long period of time, the population changes. So let's go back through our little cartoon fruit fly friends here and show an example here. So we have our population of fruit flies over time. There's an overproduction of offspring. So now we have more in the population than can survive. Mutations in sexual reproduction produce variations. So this is where we get the change starting to happen. This is where change comes in. All right. And we can go back and let's use our example. So we have our little fruit fly guys. And let's say that these antennas are he's gonna have some antennas. And these antennas are gonna be there. All right, so they have some of these. Everyone's got kind of these little green antennas, reasonable size, whatever. All right, so all these guys have green antennas, and they're all living happy lives. And there's an overproduction of offspring now, so there's a little bit of competition starting to happen. And that is definitely a main factor throughout. Here, where we have our change, as the mutations in sexual reproduction produce variations among offspring. So, because random genetic mutations occur, and just sexual reproduction has variation, we talked about how that happens, we can get a change in some organisms. So struggle for survival, changes, mutations. Now we have a couple of fruit flies with these purple antennae. So moving on. Limited resources leads to struggle for survival between offspring. So what happens is, let's say something happens where these purple antennas make them better able to survive and reproduce. So what's going to happen is, over time, our purple antenna guys are going to be the ones that remain. And we can go back and say our green guys here died because their green antennas weren't great for finding food. So what happens is our survivors reproduce more successfully, and now we see our population start to shift. And over time, entire populations can change from one variant to another. In this case, we're ending with all these purple fruit fly antennas, and remember we started with the green. So ultimately we get a shift in our population over time because of these 6 steps. A couple more terms we need to know: speciation and a species definition as well. We started the year off talking about species definitions. Ecology is not new. The requirements: they must be interbreeding populations of organisms, common gene pool, reproductively isolated. Speciation is the formation of new distinct species through the process of natural selection. So some of our key words in there. I wanted to show you an example that this really isn't all about looks. The western and eastern meadowlarks, here are pictures of them. They're totally different species because they do not interbreed. All right, that's what makes them different. They look the same. They don't interbreed because their breeding song is different, so they don't really want anything to do with each other in nature. And they've developed a different song over time, which has caused them to evolve separately from each other into distinct species, even though they share many, many similar physical characteristics. Speciation comes in the form of isolation. A lot of the time, organisms are close enough to migrate to cause distinct populations to arise. The distances between them is great enough to reduce interbreeding, and ultimately we get these separate pockets of population. New species form over time when they're isolated. That's a key takeaway. We'll talk about salamander video in class a little bit. Here we're going to look at these north rim and south rim organisms here. We have our squirrel and our chipmunk, and we see it between these populations, the south rim and the north rim individuals. They look very similar, again, like those meadowlarks. They're isolated. They become distinct separate species over time. So speciation occurred from isolation. We see that here. North rim, south rim, we get the same idea, that some of these populations are isolated over here. There's our squirrel, by the way. And then they get isolated. So we have some purple ones over here. Let's say the other ones were green ones here. And what happens over time is they go back and forth, and then as this divide gets too big, the migration stops, and we develop a new population on this side and a new population on this side over a very long period of time.